This episode is part of a series produced with the support of the SF Urban Program of the Architecture Department at Cal Poly.
And I'm mostly going to talk about two sort of separate categories. One of them is what I call work A, which is the work that we do in the city. And in this case, I'm just going to talk about San Francisco because it's easier, though we work in other cities, and about just sort of the basic issues of housing. And I know that now that the pandemic is rampant and people are scared to live in cities, they may think this is futile, but actually I was listening to your thing with Taya Talk, and I agree. I think that, cities are still the way that we need to live. So I think the thing that we have to realize is that in San Francisco, and generally in California, we're about 3.5 million units short of the number of units that we need to house all the people that we have. And that's as many units are as needed for all the rest of the USA. So we carry an enormous burden of this extremely large population with this extremely vibrant economy. Or it was, and it will be again, I'm assuming. And then in San Francisco, we just can't produce the housing fast enough, right? And despite this attempt to do that, we're always kind of behind. And this fact that we're behind is one of the things that contributes to, poverty, homelessness, and all the rest of the things that are not really desirable, and create this very sort of unjust world. And we are still, trying to catch up, and we can't catch up because we just can't get enough units permitted quickly enough to make it work. So, the embarrassing news is that in San Francisco, we have this thing called the Regional Housing Need Allocation, and we wouldn't reach. It will take San Francisco until 2030 to reach that RHNA, and it will actually not meet its very low income housing allocation until 2063, which is ridiculous, right? So, and this is actually one of the better towns because we actually develop a lot of affordable housing, and we are trying to push housing through, that we really pretty much have a terrible system of approving and projects, so it's really slow. But there are places like Irvine and Santa Clara where they would not meet their current allocation of affordable housing in another 2,000 years, because basically they're just not building it, and they're not wanting to build it because they don't feel that it's safe or whatever. So we have to understand that we're not really doing that well, frankly, and that we really have to be pushing all these agendas, because that's part of the reason why we are unhappy about some of the ways our cities are functioning, and we're also unhappy about the traffic that we have, and we're unhappy about too many people and on the road or commuting or whatever it is. And also people are unhappy because they have to go too far because they live very far from where they work, which is really not good for quality of life and certainly not good for our environment. So that's pretty embarrassing. It's better than nothing in San Francisco because we do have a whole bunch of units in the pipelines, but it's still not enough of them. And we have a lot of projects, and some of them are all down here. You can see Candlestick Park, Pier 70, Schlage Lock, Mission Rock, Hope SF, Treasure Island, Park Merced, India Basin, and then Potrero Power Station, which just got approved, and Balboa Reservoir. We're working on a bunch of these different ones. We're working on Treasure Island, we're working on Park Merced, and are going to be involved in a couple more, hopefully, down there. So we understand the trying to sort of keep up with this, but we also understand that it's really slow going. And of course, this economy right now, it's certainly not going to help. But no matter what, it's slow going. And for one thing, before this pandemic happened, one of the biggest challenges in San Francisco, probably in the Bay Area in general, was just the cost of construction. So it was basically slowing down projects because they just didn't make any financial sense anymore. And it's so expensive to even build affordable housing because it really costs as much as to build market rate housing that, it was strangling the ability to sort of get anything done. So what we do here in San Francisco is try to sort of work within that context and that framework. And really what I always say is that at this point in the city, the sites that are left and the things that we're trying to deal with is what I call kind of these urban scars. And what we're trying to do is once we're giving these sites or we're helped to sort of kind of implement working on these sites, we're trying to sort of figure out a way to stitch all this fabric back together. And the reason that these sites are left is because they were usually sites that were undesirable because they had freeways on top of them or they had car ramps, and that made them sites that, people weren't jumping on to do stuff on, right? So, but once the freeways got torn down or the car ramps got abandoned or the on-grade parking lots became undesirable, then they become a place that you can sort of infill. And they're kind of scattered around everywhere in the city, and you're sort of kind of infilling within them. And the really great thing about these things is that these mixed-use infill projects that you put on these sites are there, and they're kind of trying to recreate these neighborhoods and enhance them, right? So you're sort of kind of working with this in the existing context. And for us, that's really important, is this idea of making these projects that kind of make better what is already there and kind of work within that existing context, but at the same time sort of trying to kind of propel it further into the sort of 21st century. One of the ones that's been really important is the Central Freeway. So in San Francisco, we had these freeways that used to kind of cut through the middle of the city. One of them was the Central Freeway, which basically was built, I don't know, in the 60s or something like that, and then was heavily damaged in the earthquake in 1989. It almost got rebuilt, and it was a terrible piece of urban infrastructure because even though it allowed you to get on the freeway really quickly, which people loved, of course, it really severed the left and the right part of the town, right? So on the right side, you had sort of Civic Center, City Hall, and all these incredible sort of public buildings. And so that part of the city was okay. And then on the left side, you basically had this kind of more ghettoized neighborhoods, which just couldn't seem to lift themselves off the ground. This, once the freeway came down, is what is now known as Hayes Valley, which is one of the most, popular neighborhoods in San Francisco. So I think part of what you realize too is that as an architect, it's not just about what the architect does, it's also what you do in a global context, in a global community. The Central Freeway was torn down finally, and it was really through the work of this incredibly sort of prominent group of architects and urban planners and landscape architects that all lived in Hayes Valley and were determined to not let them rebuild that thing because they felt that was an urban blight, and they were right. So it took, 20 years more or less to get it torn down. But when it was finally torn down, the neighborhood restitched itself, and I'd say probably took about 5 to 6 years for that to all happen. And it's amazing how a city can heal itself so quickly because it just wants to, just wants to take over that space and put it back together. So that's always really exciting to us. So, and these images, of course, you can see, not everybody can see, but the difference, and probably for people who've been to San Francisco recently, you just know what Hayes Valley is like. It's that booming part of town. Everybody loves it. There's tons of, we used to love it. We used to be able to go outside, but one day when we couldn't go outside again, restaurants, places to hang out, outdoor spaces, and of course it's flat and very close to public transportation because it's near Market Street. So really highly desirable. So what happened when the Central Freeway came down is that this odd configuration of sites became available, and they basically just followed the freeway, right? And the freeway ramps, and then there were some sites that were also just storage for Caltrans and stuff like that. So all these sites became available, and then they became part of a development a contest that the city set up, and we were able to work on 2 of these projects. One of them was Parcel A, which is an affordable housing project, which is the first project that got done in this kind of Central Freeway redevelopment, which was 101 units of affordable housing, which we finished a while back. And then another one was Parcel H, which was basically a condo project. So for us, in all these cases, we really see the opportunity of kind of blending sort of this idea of how you best can be an urban citizen, and at the same time doing these buildings that are very kind of sort of program centric, but also sort of, I think, driven by their context. And the context is different in the city from block to block. So the senior housing project was really about creating this very dynamic building on the street, 9 stories. We wanted a place that was very transparent so that we didn't hide the seniors away. A lot of these people are in their, mid to late 60s, extremely dynamic, still completely capable of taking care of themselves, because this is an independent living facility. And we really felt it was important to show just what a vital part of the community they are. In most cases, these people have been school teachers or, important people that have done a lot of significant work for their community. So anyway, so that got finished. It had a park across the street. We tried to use that as a way to kind of broaden the reach of the units inside and outside. It's quite small units, of course, because they're senior housing. So they're usually one bedrooms and studios, and try to make them as, compact as possible to sort of get as many units as possible. And then the other one that we went to work on afterwards was 400 Grove, which this is a condominium project. So again, completely different program, completely different set of probably of kind of concerns and aesthetics, size of units, all that very different, but the sort of overall process that we go through to design these buildings is sort of the same. It's very analytical of what the site is like, very analytical of what the context is, and then it's about stitching those things together. In this case, this project is at the corner of Grove and Gough. Gough has now become this highly traveled street because it basically, when this freeway came down, of course, a lot of the traffic had to go to be surface traffic. So we wanted to create a building that was very dynamic on the street and really address this notion of kind of transparency. And even though we like a good urban wall, we also like to sort of kind of break up the urban wall so that there's more of a connection between people who live inside the building and people outside. And there's a sort of sense of being part of a larger community. So the building has a very large portal, and that portal is a very dynamic shape that kind of cuts through the whole building a little bit like a canyon, and then allows people to have decks and to look out onto the street, but it also allows people on the street to look through and across and sort of see the courtyard beyond. So the analysis of the site was all about this idea of how do you stitch all these things together. San Francisco has a very strong sort of urban context. It has a very strong context of open space in the back of the lot and then buildings that front the street. So it's about playing with that context, but then it's also about kind of shredding it and kind of reusing it. When you put the last building on a whole, basically city block, that last building in a way is the last piece of the puzzle, right? And so it has to fit that puzzle, because if it doesn't, then you're not making the puzzle whole, right? So for us, it was very important that this thing actually take some of the existing conditions of the site and put them back together.
That's really fascinating.
If you look at these slides.
Yeah, go ahead.
What?
Go ahead. No, continue, please.
So anyway, and then the other thing that we're really good at is we're really good at planning speak. So we find arguments that we know that the planning department is going to love. So we get to do what we want to do. And what we want to do is better, I think, for the city, but the planning department also has its own set of rules. And some of those rules we don't like because we don't think they make any sense. So in this case, we were allowed to not put the open space at the end of the site, but to put it in the middle, because it gave us much more units that were all south facing, which is really what we wanted. We wanted to be able to create this portal, which is really kind of breaking up the city wall. And they were okay with that too. So, but you have to, tell them sort of the arguments that they understand why it is that you're doing this for them and why it's better. They love this building, so it's good now, but, it takes a little bit of maneuvering. So planning speak is very important. Lesson number 1 in architecture, learn how to talk to your planners. So anyway, so that was super fun. And then, it's a really dynamic building on the street. It has this kind of wavy facade. The other thing that we wanted to get away from was what we call bay window disease, which is an inherent problem in San Francisco because everybody wants a little bay window because it's free real estate because it goes over the sidewalk. But we wanted to do something that was more dynamic and sort of kind of more fluid. So we kind of took the bay windows and knitted them together. And then made that work more or less within the context of what the bay windows can be and separated the floors and stuff. So it's about creating a very sort of kind of iconic building at a corner and sort of having it kind of flow through and sort of kind of stitching together all these different sort of factors.
We've seen this building actually, and when we had walked by it, we both commented on that we liked it, in fact, and we of course noticed all the specific architectural moves that you discussed, but of course the big one with that giant opening that leads to some kind of space beyond. The question I had, which you sort of already answered, was, like how difficult is it to convince, I guess, planners in this case that you want to do something and it's for, it's for the better of the city and this particular block. When you say you have to speak in their language, what exactly does that mean?
Well, it sort of means that you have to understand what their set of concerns are, and you have to be able to address them, right? So if their street wall is really an important thing to them, then you can sort of say, well, on the ground floor, the street wall is respected because it's actually kind of a really nice restaurant on the ground floor and it goes all the way across. But what this does is that it kind of opens the building to this, to the context beyond. People can see the whole open space beyond. And also you can talk about the fact that Gough has become a very kind of loud and dense street, right? And that maybe all these buildings that turn away from the street, because that's what happens. I mean, if you make a very strong street wall, often what you do is you create a privatized space on the other side for people who live in the building, but you don't have much interaction between you and the rest of that world, right? Mm-hmm. Because all you have is a lobby, basically. And then you talk about the fact that you kind of feel like now it's time to reopen the street because the street might have become too much of a kind of, strong wall, right? And they get that, right? So, and then the other thing that was difficult in this particular case, and I can go back, is, we had to convince the client to lose 2 units.
I was just going to ask you that.
Not always really very easy to do. But hey, there you go. That was the other argument. And, they wanted to do really good, interesting buildings, right? And so they were willing to do that because they were, determined to do some of the best architecture they possibly could in the city of San Francisco. I mean, that was their kind of prerogative. So they sort of lived through that. And in the process, I think they created units that were much better because we told them, well, this way, you have a lot of units that are double aspect or have wraparound windows. And I think all that stuff is highly desirable. People want as much light as possible into their units. So it created a whole series of outdoor spaces and decks and stuff that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. But it was a challenge. So it's a combination of that, of addressing these things that, planning is going to care about and also convincing your client that they're okay with losing all these units. So that's one of the views that you have when you're down on the street and you look up and you can see all these private decks we've created off of this kind of opening and how we've used that as a way to sort of give people adjacencies and outdoor spaces that are different one from the next. So, and then that's the street. So you get a sense of the street, and we made the ground floor plan as a restaurant. We made it as open and as glassy as possible, so you can sort of see through it, and you can actually see through it all the way to the courtyard. So there's also a relationship between the building and this retail space. That means that this retail space, basically this restaurant, which is quite good, has become kind of like an adjunct space for all the residents. They all go there all the time and eat and stuff because I feel like it's really part of their community, which is great, sort of the idea. Anyway, and a very dynamic shape on the street, right? That was the fun of it. And then we also used this crazy handrail material for the facade. And why we did that exactly, I can't remember, but no, I'm just kidding. It was fun. Anyway, we wanted some material that also spoke to some of the traditional forms in San Francisco. And really, San Francisco in the old days really only used 2 or 3 different materials. You had concrete for older buildings. You had brick, and then you also had wood, right? So if you think of all the Victorians that are all the 3 or 4 story buildings in San Francisco, a lot of them are wood, a little bit of stucco maybe sometimes. So we wanted to go back to that idea that wood has this incredible richness and this incredible texture, but we wanted to do it in a way that was very modern. And so we worked really hard on making this work because it's actually a rain screen. It was pretty complicated. And we also liked the idea of using something that basically you could buy at the hardware store. You'd have a hard time finding this much of it at the hardware store, but nonetheless, it's a kind of hardware store material that's just basically wooden dowels, right? So, and we've just put them together in this kind of interesting way. And then they really help to accentuate the kind of wave of the building, which was also the idea. So it's up, it's great, it's doing fine. They're all stained and very heavy stained. And I think they have that texture that everybody likes, right? And the other thing about them is that they're, of course, very good for the environment because, we've sequestered a bunch of carbon through the use of these sustainably harvested wooden dowels. So that's always good, we feel, and, does the justice to the site. So that's also a view when you're in the courtyard, which is 5 feet up from grade. You can see all the way out to the street and you can see through the restaurant. So that's what I was talking about. The restaurant almost becomes a part of your living space. Courtyard's super fun. We use the same dowels on a very cheap staircase. This is called window dressing, but it works. So sometimes, you find materials and you want to bring them in, but they're also a really good way to sort of make a staircase, which is basically a kind of prefabricated system, a little bit more interesting to look at. And then there's a very nice landscaping job done by Marta Fry Landscape, which is quite lush and makes the whole space seem very private, even though it's right off the street. So the other 2 ones that I'm going to show quickly are these 2 other projects that we worked on, which are Transbay Block 9, which is called 500 Folsom now, and Transbay Block 8, which turned out to be across the street from each other. These are 2 sites that we got as a competition that we did with other architects and developers. So the first one was with SOM and Essex and TMG, and the one across the street, which is called the Avery and Transbay Block 8, we did with OMA from New York, actually. so Rem Koolhaas's firm, and Related, which is the developer. So we first got this one, Translate Block 9, and then got the other one after. So incredibly great opportunity for us to work on these very large buildings because they're towers with basically podium buildings, and we worked on the podium buildings, but then we also worked, and interfaced very closely with the tower and how that all happened. So very exciting. These sites, again, were made available by what I call scar sites when freeway off-ramps were taken down because of the earthquake, and then these sites were left and were available to be developed. They are very tall, and the idea is that the fact that they're taller and they've all been upzoned allows you to put very high percentages of affordable housing within the projects themselves. So this one, 500 Folsom, I think, has 22% affordable, and then the other one across the street, which is the Avery, has, I think, 27% affordable. So those are pretty high ratios, and that's what buys you all these extra floors. So the one in the front is 450. This one is 450.
What do you mean by upzone for the students who might not know what that means?
So that means that in the old days, this neighborhood didn't allow you to have such buildings that were this tall, but they understood that the only way to get the kind of amount of affordable units they wanted was to allow you to build more units, right? So you build more units, you have more profitable units, and those profitable units can then pay for the non-profitable units, which are the affordable ones.
Got it.
Make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so this whole redevelopment of this whole neighborhood and Rincon Hill were actually projects that I worked on when I was just out of school with Dan Solomon, and we worked on these urban plans, and we're one of the first ones that suggested that if we raise the heights of all the buildings, and depending on how much affordable housing you wanted, you could raise them, 100 feet, 50 feet, 70 feet, whatever it is, you could then get higher ratios of affordable projects, which turned out to be a really good idea because otherwise you would never get this amount of affordable housing. So the great thing about it is that the affordable housing here is kind of mixed and with the other units. So on this one, we basically, what this is doing, sorry, black now. Anyway, super complicated site. There was a horrible building in the back. That's like gray mass there. That got built, I don't know why. Somebody sold off part of the site, which they should have never done a long time ago. And then it wound up really constricting the site, making it very difficult to make something work. But again, the big idea here was to create a connection so that the building opens up and it allows to have a shortcut through the building. So you can go to this park that's in the back now that's being built underneath the freeway ramp. And you can also use that as a way to connect the building a little bit like our portal did before in the other project and create this great connection between city and residents. So anyway, it goes on. But I'm not going to spend too much time on this because these are super complicated. But the site's there. You can see the building I was talking about in the back. That's that kind of little pie-shaped thing. And then we had to really cram our building against it. So we were responsible for the first 85 feet. And then after that, the tower rose from there. But because of the way we designed it with SOM, we also wanted the tower to reach the ground. So it's this complicated interface between us and SOM and how we made it work. Anyway, it's fine. And then the tower is a series of these maisonettes, as we call them, and they're 9 stories. So you stack them. And they have this more residential quality because you read that 9-story datum over and over again, which I think quite nice. It works quite well. Anyway, 450 feet, up it goes. They're finished almost now. This one's a little bit behind schedule, but it's kind of done. That shows you Block 8, which is the Avery, which is the other one we worked on. Anyway, super important to get, these kind of nice lobbies and retail and townhouses. These are all requirements that the city had, and trying to feed all this urban space and keep it really integrated with all these entrances off of the street that really helps to sort of animate this incredibly new boulevard, which is Folsom Street. And it's really starting. They now call this neighborhood East Cut. I have no idea when that happened, but I just noticed that yesterday anyway. And then, some parking entrances that are very complicated. So to kind of mitigate all these different ideas. And then we saw our building so we saw the towers landing on the ground. This is something that Craig and I worked on together. Craig was the design director at SOM at the time. And then we saw ourselves as creating these 3 kind of bookends that kind of go around the building and kind of flank it in a way and sort of kind of hold it in. And they're purposefully quite differently articulated, though they're in the family of the tower, so that they give it a sense of not being this completely homogeneous sort of development. It's really hard in these projects to figure out how to get podium and tower to relate, and you can either make the podiums just look like the tower, but then you often get this kind of, I think, big sort of mass of building on the street that doesn't have much texture, or you have to figure out a completely different vocabulary and you have to still tie them together.
Yeah.
So that just shows you that building, the different projects, number of units, and anyway, quite complicated. Very complicated to build. So this is it on the street. That's the tower coming down to the ground. You see one of the first tubes there. And then the tubes rotate, as we call them, and they have a short distance and a long distance. And the short distance is basically a very long and vertical distance, and it's supposed to remind you a lot of kind of the vertical sort of expression of buildings in San Francisco. And then the broader thing turns the corner. That's that beautiful residential entrance perspective of the cafe that's getting finished now. And then that's when you step away. This one too has a portal. That's our building right there at the bottom. It has a big portal in here, which is helping to sort of break up the mass of that building. And it's also, that's a very prominent facade that you see as you drive down Folsom. So we wanted to have something that's a little bit more expressive. And that's it. Under construction. Kind of looks like the rendering.
Yeah.
I always like it when that's done. Beautiful material. We got to use this incredible sort of cast concrete panels, precast concrete. They're really nice. They have a lot of texture. They're not all completely homogeneous in color, which I really like. And I think they work well. As you can tell, we've got this kind of burnt sienna color that's going through our building and also going through the SOM building. And that kind of ties the two together, as well as the fenestration. So that's it now. It's almost done. So that's the tower. And you can see the tower, how it reads with those kind of 9-story maisonettes, and then that locks it in with our thing. So incredible opportunity. It was really, really good to work with SOM on this. They kind of appreciate our design aesthetic. We appreciate theirs, and it's just a way to kind of really make a difference. And then as part of working on this one, then we got to do the site across the street. And this one is less impacted by having another building on it, which really helps. So it's bigger. It's also taller. It's 100 feet taller for the tower. And in this case, we worked with MA very closely. We were sort of basically OMA's eyes and ears in town because we knew a lot about the context here. So they kind of relied on us to help them do this. They do a lot of site analysis, which I love because we sort of think the same way. And that site analysis was about kind of coming through and figuring out, where is this block? How does it work? How can it weave in more successfully with what the existing context in, and how can we take some of the things that don't work on the site and make it work? So I won't belabor this point because it's hard to understand if you're just an audio person, but I think the thing that we found with OMA, and they had a smaller office in New York, was that there was a real sort of synergy between the way we think and the way they think, and we were able to sort of create this dialogue about how to best address this building. But one of the great things that we were looked at doing is the city required, the planning department's requirements were that you had this courtyard in the middle that was open to everybody in the building, and then that was how it worked, right? And so, the tower was here, that was prescriptive. The affordable housing was here, which was our end. And then you had, a courtyard that everybody shared. And we sort of felt that that was, again, a little reductive and didn't really take full advantage of the site. So we suggested that by creating a diagonal cut through the building, we could actually create a much more dynamic relationship between the different buildings, but we could also help stitch the neighborhood together because you could use this as a kind of way to cut through and to kind of be able to meander through the neighborhood like people love, right? People love mid-block passageways. They love ways to be able to cut through a site and sort of discover new things. And in the process, we could create what we call this urban living room, which would become a place for everybody. And it was supposed to be surrounded by retail and food court, which is still in the works. So that was the diagonal cut. Then we looked at chamfering the cut to make it even more pronounced and get more light down there. We based the size of all of this on existing San Francisco context. And then that same cut then traveled up the facade of the tower. So it was about this urban move that also became a building move. So that's pretty great because I think that that's what makes and locks the building in its context and its place, is that it's not just, it's hard with towers. It's easy just to say, okay, with the tower, it's glass and I'm done, right? But I think when you try to do something that has much more of a sort of kind of groundedness and is grounded in what it does, then, you have this ability to create a building that's completely interwoven, bottom, top, and bottom, which was really fun for us. So our buildings were the smaller little blocks. that were 9 stories, and they were all affordable housing, even though the work that we did was incredibly interrelated with OMA because everything depended on everything else, right? Super complicated. So anyway, and then this mid-block cut also meant that we could get much better light into the courtyard that the city had required. And it also became a shortcut because often what happens in San Francisco is you can go up the hill to go down the hill. And in this case, you could just cut across flat, which everybody loves. It's one less hill to climb. So it's working all these dynamics, right? And looking at the things that are going to make everything better. So, you don't want a super steep street that then is going to try to have an urban living room on it because then the complications are infinite, right? Particularly with ADA accessibility and stuff like that. But you also don't want to create an urban living room or a kind of outdoor space that's really has no natural light, because then nobody's going to want to go there. And the tower is 550 feet tall. So when we studied this flash, we looked at how the light penetrated deep, and it really does work. I mean, in the summer, it gets light all the way across.
Wow.
So anyway, so that's the urban living room. So in a way, the thing that I really like about this scheme, and these are our buildings around it, and people can see that later. But anyway, the thing about it for me, and I studied architectural history, is that the living room, the space in the middle, that is a place where people hang out, it is a perfect rectangle or almost a perfect rectangle. And then our buildings around it all deform to make that work, right? So this is a very Baroque idea. The Baroque would do this all the time. They decide to put a plaza somewhere, and then they would just make the buildings around it work, right? So they would add, false fronts, or they would do whatever, or they would build these buildings in these very strange shapes, particularly in Rome, just because they felt that having that plaza was absolutely so important. And we felt the same way. We felt that the plaza had to be a real space, and you had to sense and the definition of it, to be able to understand it. And then it just did whatever it did to the buildings around it. So our buildings are pretty strange in plan. They work fine, but they are not something that you would normally do if you were just building something, completely contextless in the middle of a prairie or something like that. So anyway, right. That was fun. And then it's all about them being all about Market Cafe and Market Hall. That was really led by the developer. They really wanted to have this very active outdoor space where there were cafes and restaurants and things like that. And all those things were under construction until recently. I think they're probably starting back up again. So they have been true to this tradition. Anyway, So that's it. But you can see what I'm talking about. I mean, our building is pretty strange, right? And this one too. Whatever. Okay. And, as I said, you would never, but what was really important is for us to still read that room, right? And to maintain those corners and to make that all work. So, and when you're there and when you're inside the space, you see why that matters, right? So anyway, sticking to those rules and making them an integral part of how you work this thing becomes a really important thing. So anyway, 548 units, a bunch of condos, a bunch of rental, and then the affordable pieces at the bottom here, which are owned by an affordable housing developer. The other thing that influenced us here was just the existing context of existing buildings in that neighborhood. And it's one building that still has a few really nice brick buildings. So we thought, wow, it'd be great to use brick. So we did, and it turned out the developer from New York loved brick because they're New Yorkers. So we did do that. So this is the 2 buildings now. That's the big tower done by SON. You can see the kind of chamfering that happens. And then we have one blue building, really where the color was chosen because it relates well to the tower, and one red one. The developer really liked the 2 colors. I think they're okay, actually. I was a little bit more worried at first, but I think it's fine. And then you can tell that these buildings are pretty kind of goofy, and one of them really looks like a flat iron, and then the other one's like, I don't know, some carved up sort of fun thing. We're able to try to make brick look modern by being able to do these brick screens. That was really complicated, and actually it's really nice that the developer didn't get rid of those because they were pretty hard to make work, but I think they give the thing a whole palette. And then they also help mostly in the little alleyway because they provide privacy for bedrooms. So you can be in your bedroom, and even though you're across the street from somebody else, the screens still let light in, but you don't feel like somebody's staring right into your bedroom. So they also helped. There's a very strong base that's all retail, so you can see how that happens. The entrance to the red buildings off of this street, and then it just carves itself in and out and has these kind of pseudo bay windows and things that sort of kind of draw you in. But the main thing about these 2 buildings is that they create this incredibly nice space between them. So that's on Fremont. So that's the building as a kind of composition. That's probably the biggest building we'd ever done. in terms of size. So it was pretty important for us to put that in. And then it was amazing because once it was done, we're like, wow, it's not that big because everything else around it is so large. So we're like, wow, I could torture ourselves over that one and that. But this was a hard building to design. There were a lot of cooks, but I think in the end, all the cooks did a good job and it helped make it better. We had a lot. But anyway, so the main space for us is this space, right? This incredibly great sort of urban living room, paseo that takes you all the way through. You can see the city beyond, and it's going to have all this incredible retail. And it's really wonderful to be able to participate in making some of these urban spaces that will be around forever, right? And I mean, I don't know how much people look at the buildings, but they certainly love walking up and down this alley and kind of seeing it. And we based the dimension of it actually on Maiden Lane. I don't know if you know that place in San Francisco, but it's a really famous alleyway in San Francisco. And we were like, okay, you know, how wide does it need to be comfortable? And so we went and measured that one and sort of based it on this one. It works great, actually. So always good to go back. So it's good to go back to context. You know, that's where knowing your city well and understanding the things that are there and understanding the things in your city that really work and some of the things that don't work and how you need to sort of be able to use those tools. Because when you make these buildings, unless they're really good urban buildings, I don't care how beautiful they are, they're useless for me, right? So for us, it's trying to make them really good buildings and really interesting pieces of architecture, but also making them incredible sort of urban buildings that really help to heal this urban fabric, right? Which is sort of back to the scar thing. Anyway, so that's the living room space, which has this nice transparency across, and you can see all the lights bouncing around in there. So it's pretty fun. Anyway, so we just got finished, and then that's from afar. So, so the conclusion to this first series of talks is, or this first part is, we worry in California about density, right? And we worry about how dense our cities are. And we talk about this, and with this pandemic, I'm sure it's going to come back up. Oh, we should all live in the country. It's much safer and stuff like that. But so San Francisco has 6,658 people per square mile. Sao Paulo has 18,690 people per square mile. Now, you might say, so most people like San Francisco, I think. It's pretty dense, though, but it's not nearly as dense as Sao Paulo. Now, most people might say, oh, Sao Paulo, look at it. It's terrible. It's all these high-rises. It's so insane, and I don't want to live there. But then you go to Paris, which you'd probably agree that most everybody loves, right? And it's got 55,000 people per square mile. So you can make an incredible architecture. You can make an incredible city and just still have a lot of people living there, right? So there's nothing that doesn't work. It's just that you got to design it correctly. And I think part of the things that we're trying to do on the Trans Bay is to be very cognizant of creating these incredible buildings that are both good neighbors, but also sort of introduce a whole new set of values to what you can do in a city, right? So I think I always tell people, you know, Paris, does anybody hate Paris? Not that I know of. I certainly don't. So that's the work A, which is more the buildings and stuff like that. And then I have a few more slides about work B.
Okay.
Got time?
Yep. Great.
What time is it? I don't even know what time it is.
We have about an hour and 5 minutes.
Oh, great. Then you can ask a million questions. Okay, so this is, work B is being a woman architect. And I know that a lot of people want to say that they're an architect first and a woman second, or they're a woman first and an architect second, or that. I'm a woman architect. I mean, there is no doubt to me that everything I have done in my career has been heavily influenced by being a woman, obviously, but also about the place that being a woman architect has put me in relationship to the field, right? So I don't want to shy away from it. I'm a kind of diehard feminist here, so I'm going to talk about this a little bit too, because I think it's really important for people to understand, and for other women and younger students and people coming up in the field to understand what it means to be a woman architect. So anyway. A while back, Nicholas Orosoff, who used to be the New York Times critic of architecture, organized a conference and then wrote a piece that was called Keeping Houses, Not Building Them, which was really about the fact that why weren't there more people and more women particularly designing more buildings? And where were they, you know? And so my answer to this is we build houses, we don't keep them. Don't really like keeping house, as I've really noticed during this pandemic. So I'm hoping never to have to do that again. But anyway, we have been, and my philosophy has been to build buildings, right? I mean, that's what we've wanted to do, and that's what we keep trying to do in the office. So it's very important to me to present myself that way. And I do a lot of talks to a lot of women, among others, to talk about this. I think the field of architecture is still structured in such a way that it keeps the status quo. And I think white, economically privileged men are firmly in place. Now, I have nothing wrong with any of these guys. They're all great architects. Like, I admire their work. I look at it. But they just can't be the only ones that represent our society or represent this field. Because if we don't have a field that is as open as the society is, or as diverse as our society is, then we're not creating an architecture and environment that's as strong and as imaginative and as innovative as it could be, right? Because we're basically shutting out half of our population. Now, we understand this pretty well when it comes to migrants and locking them up in whatever, those camps, but and how terrible that is. But we also have to understand that we can do this in a lot of different ways, and a lot in ways that are maybe less kind of obvious, but are still there because the discrimination is so strong. So 50% of architectural graduates, I'm sure you've heard this, are female, and yet only 18% of them are registered architects in the United States. And 1 or 2% are people of color, which is terrible, right? So we find ourselves in this world where, a lot of people go to architecture school, a lot of women go to architecture school, and they start disappearing, right? And this is getting better, but it's really still not great. And we talk about this as the missing 32%, and I think Rosa Chang is the one who started this language, but it's still there, and particularly when you get to my age, because I'm no younger spring chicken, there's not many people of us women left at the top doing stuff. So, you just find yourself more and more marginalized. So, and then people who are principals and owners of their own firms, like I am, make up between 3 to 5% of all the architectural firms in the USA. Now, you get it. 50% women go to architecture school. Only 3 to 5% of them wind up owning their own firm. What does that mean? It just means that it's too hard. Like, you just can't do it. Like, you're not getting the jobs, and other things are getting in the way. I understand there's children, this and that and the other thing, but the whole way this thing is structured has to be kind of really changed around. So anyway, so for me, being a woman and being a woman architect has really kind of influenced everything I do. I mean, I have a deep commitment to women's reproductive rights, rights to abortion, family planning, affordable health care. And we worked for Planned Parenthood for decades, doing all their clinics here in the Bay Area because of that. Because I felt that it was really important that women should be able to get affordable health care without feeling like they were going to a prison or that they're going to be shot at. I have a real consideration of how design impacts all genders and what that means. And particularly now that we've become much more gender sensitive, I think that's a great thing. And then I really try to think about buildings, interact with community, and that they're part of a much larger and greater context, and that much larger and greater context is about having that dialogue. And that I think that to go to meetings and to see more young women, more young Asians, African Americans, whatever it is, anybody coming and participating is really a way for us to have a much more interesting dialogue about what our architecture wants to be in the future, right? So I'm pretty gung-ho about this, and I talk about it a lot, and I encourage, other women to sort of do the same. What are the benefits of my gender? So there are 2 benefits of my gender as being an architect, is that I know a lot about structure now and construction, but I don't really ever have to pick up a hammer and put that knowledge to use, which is great because I don't really want to. Men feel more obligated to be handy. I don't need to be handy. It's okay. It's pretty easy for me to now impress contractors because I do know a lot about construction technologies, which is good. I mean, I think I've been able to sort of kind of parlay that into a way of surprising them and getting them to sort of be impressed, which is always important. I have a really strong friendship with a lot of female architects, and we get together and talk about things. And I think probably because we feel a little bit marginalized, it puts us together and it creates a pretty strong context. So it's a lot less competitive maybe that you might have with all your other male counterparts. And then finally, and most importantly, I don't get invited to golf games with the guys because I don't, and I really don't like golf. So that's really good. So I don't have to turn them down. Works great. So anyway, so that's kind of my thing. Anyway, so the last slide to this is to say that I think being a woman architect means that you have to be an activist, or it's made me an activist, and I would encourage every other woman architect to become one, because I still believe, and I do know that this is true for everything, that you only achieve equality if you fight for your own rights. You can't assume that anybody else is going to fight for your rights, because it just doesn't dawn on them, and it's not their fight, So unfortunately, you might bring them around and they might come and rally, But really, in essence, it's up to all us women to really ask for what we want and what we should have, right? And same thing for African Americans, same thing for all the rest. I mean, I think there's a lot of people that work very hard at helping women and stuff like that, and I really appreciate them for that. But, I still feel like I have to kind of have the flag in my hand and wave it around. So voila.
Amazing. So maybe we can actually pick up the conversation with work B, since we just talked about that, and then kind of go back to work A.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I first of all, I have to say, I really appreciate your take on being a female architect. I've heard, as you said, the arguments for people saying I'm an architect first and a female, and then some saying I'm a female then an architect. And of course, the truth is somewhere kind of all of both of those things. It's not quite that simple.
No.
And I appreciate the fact that you acknowledge that your identity brings you benefits and that it's part of what you do. And there's and your identity brings value to the design. I think
I completely agree with that.
And I think that's interesting because there's a tendency sometimes, I feel like, for people to go into the extremes. Either they want to try and be colorblind to everything, which is not again really the reality, or at the other end, people use their own identity as kind of a cop-out to declare, well, this is my identity, therefore my design has more value because it's coming from me, because of my inherent identity, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I don't really believe in either of those. Yeah. So what was it like, though, when you started your office in whatever year, a few years ago, right?
Exactly. We're not going to mention years, right? We can dispense with that now. I'm over the top.
But being a female architect that had your own firm, and you've had your firm for a while, right? What was that like when you started and versus now? Because now in current times, obviously there's still struggles, and based on the statistics that you had mentioned, there's still much progress to be made. But it is for sure a much more accepting society in general.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think there are two things. So I'm a kid of the 70s, or the late 60s and the 70s. So, that was when things were pretty sort of liberal, and there was a lot of social movement about. So I came out of college, and then I came to go to graduate school at Berkeley, and it was a 50-50 class, right? There were 50% women, 50% men. There was some discrimination in the school, I have to say, pretty serious discrimination from some of the guy professors. They're all pretty young, and they're all, whatever. Okay, well, dispense with it, but anyway, there was some of that. But there was a sense still that as a woman architect in school, you got to do whatever you wanted, right? I mean, nobody was holding you back. And so then you went out into society, and I worked in a couple of firms to start, including Dan Solomon. And, at Dan's office, he had a lot of women working there, including Paulette Taggart, and it was a pretty sort of open field. But you were kind of sheltered from the reality of what it meant to be really a woman architect, because you weren't out there getting the jobs, and you weren't out there really interacting with people that way. So when I started my firm, I was completely naive, and I had no idea. I mean, basically, let's just be frank. I had no business plan. I had nothing but I don't feel like working for anybody else, and I've got a couple of jobs that people want me to do, and I'm just going to do them, right? In hindsight, probably a business plan and a little bit more thought about what it was like to do that would have helped and probably been a good idea, which I recommend to people now to do, but I didn't do that. So I just went out and I stepped out. But I think the thing that happened is that it took an incredibly long time for us to be able to get established enough that we could get the kind of jobs that we wanted to do, right? So I spent a lot of years puttering about trying to do, house remodels and maybe a new house occasionally and this and that. And that's why I feel like it was just hard to move on, because the contacts that I had, it wasn't comfortable for developers to hire us. As one of my professors once said to me, she said, if they hire a woman and anything goes wrong, then the first thing somebody's going to say is, well, you hired a woman architect, and so there was still this sort of reticence. And then the other ways that you got jobs, it wasn't part of my crowd either, whether it's through contractors or different kinds of things. So it was just harder to kind of get that glass ceiling to break or to move. And that's what I think it was like. I am not one to take no for an answer easily. But I think that's part of the reason that we are where we are now, right? I have a bit of a bulldog mentality, and when I get into something, I just don't want to let it go. But I don't think there's any other way. I don't see how you would do it. unless you are pretty determined and self-determined. So I think it just takes longer, and it took longer. I did a lot of teaching for a while and stuff to help with that, and got to keep myself in the fray and have a little bit of a salary and stuff. But it was, and I have no regrets. Like, I don't know if I would have done it any other way, except maybe I would have been a little bit smarter about the business plan and the kind of game plan idea. But eventually it came to us, and we found a way through it. So.
Do you feel like being a woman as of today is still sometime of an issue to get some of the projects you would want to get, or that mentality has kind of moved?
No, I don't think it's moved that much. I think it's moved some. Listen, I have enough clients who are developers to understand the way that they interact with women, and it's not always a level playing field. Now, luckily, I've gotten to be old enough that it helps in a way, because, the white hair and the kind of, clearly not 40 anymore, or 50 even. But I don't, there's some discomfort, they're not, they don't exactly know how to talk to you. They don't exactly know how to interact with you. I mean, there's a lot of things like that. And that discomfort also means that it's harder for them to sort of imagine hiring you and stuff. So I think it's better. I just don't think it's perfect. And when you see the people who are still at the head of the big firms in America or in the world, I mean, a lot of them are still men, right? Or it's it's a man and woman team, right? And so it's what I call the Remington Steele syndrome. Do you know that show? There's a silly show where this woman was a private eye, and she hired this guy to be her, for her masthead in a way, because he just looked so great. And she knew that everybody would trust a private eye who was a guy rather than a woman. Well, it's kind of the same thing here a little bit. So yes, it's better, but it's still not good enough, I don't think. And until women make exactly as much money as the men, until women have exactly the same rights and get the same job opportunities, then we're still, a few steps behind.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it makes sense what you're saying. Because the people who run the companies are of an older generation, and that change takes time. Exactly. It takes generations to kind of pass, and there's a certain way that they all speak to each other. They're all of a certain type of a person, right? Biologically, at the very least, and generally speaking, there's a certain way that guys talk to each other on the golf course about sports and stuff. And it's funny you highlight that as being like kind of awkward, and that awkwardness also influences who they're going to hire. Because it's something that I've actually mentioned myself in a weird way. Obviously, I'm a guy, but if I'm a guy.
Oh, really?
But I'm Asian, and I'm not a big muscular person. I'm not tall either, and so I've always actually felt like speaking with some of the kind of people that you're talking about, or like contractors, let's say. It's like I feel out of place. I don't follow sports. I can't golf. I don't like golf. And they don't know really how to talk to me, and they don't know how to, they can't categorize me as being, I'm going to talk to him like I would talk to a female, because he's not a female. So it is interesting though that those subtleties of how you converse with people, like that does influence how business happens.
Well, totally. And I think you have to understand, and that's what you understand as you get older, I think, in a way that, business is all about relationship making, right? So as an architect, you're a service industry, right? So unless your phone rings and somebody hires you to do a job, you're not getting a job. Right now, you can make up jobs for yourself, and you can enter competitions, which all architects do. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to sort of kind of do this. But until somebody, writes the first check and helps you live, you're still waiting for that to happen. So that phone has to ring, and there has to be a comfort level with people calling you and, helping you. So I think part of what's going to have to happen is that, more and more women are going to get into development, and they are. And, the people are our clients for related. The local person for it is a woman, and she's really good, and she's one of their VPs of development and stuff like that. And the project on Grove had a woman developer also on the team. So those things start to break down that ice, right? Because then you're not just dealing with this all male kind of older guard. But it's not all there yet. And I can understand how you would also feel like, with your sort of kind of ethnicity and sort of, build and this rest, you're not swinging the hammer around your waist like one of the guys, right?
I can swing a hammer, but I don't do it very well.
Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just a different thing. So, I mean, I think you have to understand that you're constantly trying to push that wall. And what you're trying to do is push the wall and also not alienate people, because if you alienate them all, they're really never going to call you. So it's that finessing between the two, that has been a constant drive, because I wanted to do certain things, and I wanted to do larger scale housing. And, we really went after these different disciplines because I just didn't want to do just single family homes. That wasn't the thing I wanted to be doing for the rest of my life. I wanted to do urban buildings, and I wanted to be able to build things in my city and kind of leave an imprint there of things that I thought about and wanted to do. And so all those things just sort of fall into that category. I mean, things are getting better. Listen, SOM just announced that they have a system in SOM where they have all these different principals and directors and design directors and all this thing, but they have 3 people who run the company that come from different firms. And it's like a board, right? I think there's only 3 on the board. Maybe there's a little bit more, but they've just put 3 women on that board, which is sort of extraordinary. And that's from having only 1 woman on the board. So I think they're sensing that they need to change too. And I think particularly the SOM-SF office has been extremely strong in trying to kind of push that agenda along. So it really helps, and that's it. That happens.
And then going a bit back, I'm curious. So you have you have a bachelor's in architecture, correct?
Yeah, a bachelor's also in architectural history.
And then you did your master's at Berkeley, master's in architecture.
Yeah. Yes.
But you're not from San Francisco or the Berkeley area, right?
No. I only moved here to go to graduate school, and then I never left. I'm originally from France. My parents are 100% French. My father died a long time ago, but my mother is still alive, and she lives in France, and so do all my other, cousins and aunts and things like that, whoever's left now. And I grew up partially in France, partially in Holland, the Netherlands, and then partially in the United States. So my father traveled for work a little bit, so we kind of followed him around. So that's how I came to the States. I was 4 or 5, and stayed till I was about 10 or 11. Then I went back to France for a while. But that's how we got this very bicultural sort of kind of upbringing. So all 3 of my sisters, all 3 of us, 3 girls, all speak English, and we're all now living in the United States. My 2 sisters live on the East Coast. I live here. But we've kind of had this very, kind of this life where we've gone back and forth between the 2 countries repeatedly and at different times. So that really has shaped a lot of who I am too, frankly, is a sort of bicultural kind of attitude.
Yeah, and I was curious about that because increasingly there are more and more architects in the United States, students, recent graduates, who are, they're not from the United States originally. Classes now are half, if not more than half, are international students. Have you found that perspective has been beneficial for your office, your work, and everything else?
It's so, okay, so you are who you are, right? So I'm a woman, I'm a French person. I have a French passport and everything. Where does it stop and start, right? There is no doubt that my attitude about buildings and what I look at, and that's why I was talking about architectural history, because I really come from that side, right? I come from the side of looking at buildings over time and being pretty knowledgeable about a lot of different buildings built over time. And I get that both from what I studied in school, but I also get it from an interest that came from living in these different cities like Amsterdam and Paris and stuff like that. So that is absolutely much more ingrained in my soul than, for example, being able to, build something, which frankly, you wouldn't want me to ever build anything because I'd not be very good at it. I could demo stuff. So you know what I mean? So, because I can tear anything down really fast, as my office well knows. But So that is so much a part of who I am, right? And so it's completely impossible for me to figure out, where it stops and starts, right? Because it's just in my DNA at this point. So yeah, and I go back to France all the time, and I travel a lot, and I go to Europe because for me, and I go everywhere, I don't know. South America or wherever I've been a lot of different places, Asia and stuff like that. For me, it is inherently so important to look at buildings in their context and to get to know them in person. That is the part of my great pleasure of being an architect, and my understanding of those buildings has so helped, and promoted my own sort of thinking about our own architecture. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So then transitioning a bit to the work. It sounds like then, because I think you're probably most well known for, well, I guess a lot of different things. That's hard to say, but you're certainly well known for the design itself, right? Maybe other offices are maybe not, are known for various things and not like their design and aesthetics and that kind of quality. But it seems like you've had an interest in projects at a variety of scales, almost from an early age or from the early beginning of your career. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. So, when I was at Berkeley, I took a lot of classes, among others from Dan Solomon, who I wound up working for about 4 years, kind of in housing and urban planning, which has always been an interest. And that sort of stayed with me. So that was a big part of what I was interested in. And I do come at it from the design end. I mean, I think that's what I'm trying to say is that I think you can do incredible buildings that are incredibly good in their context and still want them to be sort of innovative, interesting, new kind of approaches to a problem, right? But I don't think you need to blow up the whole context to make that work. And that's where we really come from it. So we're not interested in doing your average housing project. As I always say, we're not the cheapest or the fastest architects in town, but what we can do is we can provide you with, some extraordinarily good buildings in the place that you want to put them in, right? So that's what we bring to the table. And we bring the same idea about design to all our projects, whether they're single family homes or, much larger buildings, right? It's the same approach and we approach the problems in the same way, even though the scales are so different and the skills that you need to get them done are very different. They're still there for us. And they start from this idea of, what makes a great space for people to be in.
So when you say you have the same kind of design approach or philosophies that get applied to various projects, a bit more specifically, so what is that for you guys?
So it's a lot based on sort of, I think, tectonics, so we're really interested let's start by. So first of all, we're really interested in context, right? So whether it be the urban context and the context of San Francisco or the context of doing a house, for example, in Big Sur, like the Fall House, those two contexts are the first thing that we start with, right? It's trying to understand what those are like. And it's about topography. It's about climate. It's about geology. It's all those things come at play right now. Clearly in a city, probably they're more limited or different, very different than what they might be, for example, in Big Sur, right? Where, the sort of geology, typography, typology is again, something else. But we really care about those things, right? So we look at each thing as though each building is, as I said, its own piece, and it's in its context, right? And so we start with a kind of understanding of the context. And for us, it even applies to different neighborhoods in San Francisco where we feel like contexts are very different from one neighborhood to another. And we try to do buildings that don't, necessarily and don't look like each other because they have different places that they're in, right? So that's where we start, is that. And then from that, we kind of derive back sort of ideas about structure and kind of ideas about, which is really important because I think we live in a very earthquake dangerous area. So we want to think about that. We think about kind of environmental issues, but we also think about things like, in all cases, about section and about the ability for buildings to not just be a set of pancakes that are stacked one on top of the other. I mean, I think 400 Grove is a perfect example of that big portal where you kind of break through that. Or, houses like the Fall House, which is all about the way it kind of lays on the land and follows the topography of the site. So it has a very strong section. We always think about section. That's a big deal for me. I think that a building is section. I don't know if do you know Grafton Architects? They just won the Pritzker Prize this year.
Yeah, I've heard of them.
Irish firm. Yeah, they're great. Anyway, they talked at the Monterey Design Conference, which I helped to organize every couple of years. And they also always talk about how building is section. And I really like that because I think that is one of the things that we can do. That's how you make space, right? You cut through something and you look at how it layers across. So we do that too. So we go to section and then we just then kind of go all the way down. But our attitude about how we design a house and how we think about the materiality of it versus how we think about the materiality of a much larger building. I mean, the attitude is the same, which is we really care about the pieces of material that we use and the pieces and how they fall and make the partie of the building stronger. But of course, they're going to be very different materials and they're going to be applied very differently and they're going to have different levels of craft, right? So you can't craft a facade of a 100,000 square foot building like you're going to craft a facade of a 4,000 square foot house.
Yeah, sure.
But the attitude can be very similar.
Right. And I think that's interesting because I think there are a lot of architects who are very successful at developing their own design sensibilities and the core questions that they are always asking. They're successful at a certain scale. So let's say the scale of a single family house, right? And as soon as they have to do a larger project, let's say like a multi-story, multi-family housing project, let's say, I don't know, 5-6 stories, whatever. Though they're not, it doesn't work, and they are not nearly as successful. And it seems like with you're able to be successful at both scales, at a variety of scales. How is it that you made that transition? I don't know with which one you started, or how is it that you're able to bring those sensibilities across scales?
Fear. The fear of producing a really terrible building. It's hard. I'm not saying like the first few buildings that we did that were large, or we always did an association with somebody else, and it was kind of terrifying. It's always terrifying, frankly. I mean, all new buildings are terrifying. I always say, if you step out onto the sidewalk on the front of your house and you're not a little bit afraid every day, then there's something wrong with you, because I think it's the art of creating, the art of being creative, the art of putting together all these different things, it's very difficult, and you always fear that you're not going to be as good as the last time, right? So that stays within you. I think for me, it's just I had the interest, and I really wanted to get good at it. Like, we really wanted to be able to do good, more successful, larger buildings, right? So we looked at them and we applied principles to them that I talked about before, but we also looked at other larger buildings and how they're put together, and use that also as a way to kind of, further how we think about architecture, right? So, I mean, I always say, like, the great thing in the world is that there's a ton of great buildings out there, right? A ton, and more so, I think, because architecture has really evolved, I think, in the last 10 or 15 years. And they're there to teach you something, right? So for us, we're always looking at other buildings as a way to kind of catch up, right? Okay, so we've never done a housing project that's this big, but how has somebody else done a housing project that's this big, and how good is it, and how did they make it work, right? So it's like an open book, right? Why wouldn't you, why wouldn't you look at these things? It's like a novelist. I mean, all novelists, read other novels, right? They're trying to learn from other people. They're trying to kind of, develop and help them develop things. And so it's the same way here. So I guess for us, there's a lot of looking at other things and doing that. But, we're pretty determined. So, I don't know. I'm hoping they're okay buildings. We'll see.
Oh, I think they are.
Okay. Well, that's good. Well, thank you then. Okay, then I like you too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then, you've talked about also this kind of, there's kind of two sides, let's say, where one side is you're responding to context, right? And a building has to do that. But also there's another skill set the architect has to have to make the building itself kind of be beautiful and functional and all of these things.
Right.
And I suppose this ties into your work that you did with OMA. I forgot my question. Okay, one other question is I mean, how? But it's kind of like, the urban response portion of the design process, let's call it, is maybe perhaps more understandable as a shared project between two different offices because it's more or less fact-based, right?
Right. Yeah.
But when it comes down to the next level where you're starting to sculpt forms in a more nuanced or smaller way and pick materials and things like this, how does that process work?
You mean as a group or just on our own in our office?
Both, actually. Yeah, both. Yeah, in both.
Okay. So I think with OMA, the way it works is that, luckily our buildings were a little bit sort of separate from theirs. They had the tower and then we had those two buildings next to it, though one of our buildings was glued to theirs. So it was really about talking about it. We had a lot of different ideas for those buildings. I'm going to tell you, like, I could show you iterations of those facades. We spent, I think, 4 months working every single weekend trying to get these buildings to be right. And part of it is that the client was in New York and they were pretty fussy and it wasn't working. And also we wanted to do something that worked with OMA's building. So I have these iterations of these facades that go on. And sometimes when I do slide presentations, I show them just to amuse people, to make them understand that it's still like that. Like even in the real world, you try out things until something seems to kind of to work, to stick, right? So I actually think it's just a lot of hard kind of labor. And that what you're trying to do is you're just trying to remember always, though, what the guiding principles are, right? So if you don't, the thing that's important about having a really good urban plan and having a really good, it means that you have a really good site plan. And if you have a really good site plan, then I think that's an enormous part of being a really good building, right? Because you lose, I think, in architecture when all you're doing is you're just trying to paginate a building, right? So, and I say this in the office all the time, when we start just kind of like applying windows, scattering on facades and we're not being very good at it, I'm like, okay, we're thinking about this problem the wrong way, because it's not just pattern making, right? It's much more fundamental than that. It's structure, it's light, it's air, it's the overall kind of skin of the thing. It's, it's establishing its presence on the streets, whatever it is, right? And we were just doing that the other day because we're working on a big housing project in Treasure Island, and we're just sitting there like kind of goofing off on SketchUp with a bunch of different windows all over the place. And I just went, okay, there's something wrong here. Like we've made a mistake somewhere along this process, and we need to go back and rethink what it is that we've done wrong. And we basically changed a couple of things pretty fundamental to that project on the facade. It wasn't the planning thing, because the plan's actually pretty good, I think, the site plan. And it just changed everything. Like everything just fell into place. So I think this is part of it. It's like you got to keep going back to what really matters, right, and what you're trying to get at. And that's hard, but it gets easier because you do develop more experience, right? There is something to be said for architecture. As you get older, you do get better at it.
Well, that's
and then you have to retire. And then you need to retire because you're so tired. You need to go lie down somewhere.
Well, that's a good life.
Exactly.
Just
but it is,
margaritas.
Yes, exactly. So you do get better at it. So I don't know. It's this combination of putting all these things together, and then having a set of ideas that you're interested in and going back to those ideas. One of the things that I am very interested in is this idea of light and air, and the California minimalist and people like Robert Irving or Doug Wheeler and all those people who are always trying to figure out how to make the perception of space something that is both there but also ambiguous, and how do you make people enter a building and sense that it's there in a way that's unintended, not unintended, but that they don't know, that's unexpected, right? That it surprises them. And we try to apply that principle to all our buildings. I think that, I always say, light's cheap, it's free. The sun's there. You can take advantage of it or not. Now you got to pay for the windows, but nonetheless, it is basically there. So that's one of the things that we're always trying to sort of work on, this kind of perceptual quality of space, which is also the same thing as the section. It's about kind of weaving these things together.
I think what you're saying about when you're in the process and it feels like maybe you're just spinning in place, that there's a sign that you have to go back because something else is not right. I totally agree with that. Right. And it's something that I've kind of noticed in my own work and certainly with students and other younger designers, where when they feel like they're lost and they're just producing stuff and they can't tell what's right or wrong because one, they have tunnel vision, they're producing too many different options, and they don't have a sense of hierarchy. It's like, well, go a few steps back because there's probably something there that's going to inform you or something you missed that's allowing you to be in this kind of space of endless computer modeling or options or whatever it might be.
Yeah, totally. And the computer really does that. I mean, it's just, you just get lost in this thing, and we often say in the office, like we sit there and we design something and we're in SketchUp, because SketchUp is a pretty effective way to sort of get into stuff, you know what I mean? Or whatever program you're using. And then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, it's time to build a model. We're done. It's like, or somebody in the office says that, and Raj, Todd, whoever is out, because we've just completely we've gone down that rabbit hole and you just can't get out of it. We can't climb out of it. So I think one of the things you learn is you learn to be better at using the tools that are at your hand, but you also need to diversify the tools, right? So in the old days, we used to have little drafting mail lines. Do you remember? You probably didn't know those things anyway. They were like these bars that used to go up and down on your desk. Anyway, for the side story to this is that we had an employee who worked in our office recently, and he didn't even know what those were. He was like, "What is that thing?" Like, okay, I feel like a dinosaur. But anyway, so I would always say, I would take the drawing, and you tend to look at things always the same way, right? Because this is we're human beings, right? We like things that have a routine, right? So I would take the drawing and just turn it 90 degrees or 180 degrees. I still do that because it's amazing how differently you think of your building on paper or even on a computer if you're not always looking at it in the same direction. Mm-hmm. And it's this funny thing of just kind of trying to make your brain, do things that it's gotten used to doing only one way, right? So I think that that's what using different tools does too. It forces you to think about different things. And if you've just been sitting there, it's kind of spinning your wheels or doing the same thing over and over again in the same medium. I think you can't do that, right? So you got to broaden your reach.
Yeah, that makes total sense. That actually reminded me this is sort of an aside, but in music performance, because I played the trumpet for a long time. Anytime I was struggling with a verse or a line, the instructor would actually say, play it backwards, which makes no sense at all. And somehow it would like reset and then I wouldn't have a problem playing it forward. I don't know if that was specific to me though.
Yeah, no, see, that's the same thing. So the backwards is sort of like saying, take your drawing and turn it the other way or something like that, or reverse it, whatever it is, but do something that sort of makes your brain not see it again and again, always in the same way, right? Which is sort of what we start to do. So, yeah, totally makes sense. I like that. That's a good metaphor.
Some of the, larger or more core design questions that you bring to all of your projects that you've sort of become more aware of. I mean, I know architecture always learning, but at what point did they become kind of clearer and have body in your mind? Yeah. And do you think that starting off with, I'm assuming you started off at smaller scale projects, was kind of like a better way to kind of let those ideas incubate or form those ideas before having to tackle something larger? Yeah.
Well, I think in my case it worked. I think some people they start by just doing really big projects, and they never really do small projects, or they only do a few big small projects. And I think some other firms, if you think of big, for example, big for a reason, right? But if you think of firms like Snøhetta, they've always done small and large, right, together, and they kind of like that. I think that's part of their kind of DNA and the way they present themselves. I think for me, yes, it was important. I learned a lot from doing the smaller projects, and I learned a lot about just the thinking process of architecture and how to be able to manipulate scale and section and light and air that then I could take to the larger projects much more easily because I already knew how to do it, right? So it was important and it just worked for me. Not sure that that's the only way you have to work, but I tend to sort of like the kind of details, the kind of nitty gritty of stuff, you know what I mean? So I got pretty good at doing that at a smaller scale and then I could translate it over. And I've always said, even though the projects are very different in scale, the attitude that we take to them about materiality and how things are put together and all those things, they remain constant, right? And I think it's because we got comfortable enough with how we did that in these smaller projects or these single family homes that when we jumped ship to larger projects, we could still bring that level of craft and understanding and thinking to those projects too. So yeah, it did work for me. I also just became more comfortable about being a little bit more brazen about what we could do with design. And it takes a while, or at least for me, it took a while, right, to learn how to sort of kind of be bold enough to sort of make buildings that, show that and reflect that.
I wanted to go back to, one of your projects where you kind of slice that street through your project. And I think it's very powerful to show that to students because oftentimes I feel like they have the perception that architects are architects and urban designers are urban designers and landscapes are landscape and all the fields are kind of separated. But we do have ways as architects, especially on those larger scale projects, to have some kind of impact or design a portion of an urban space within the realm of the project itself. And I think your projects are illustrating that extremely well. And it's possible. I mean, I think those are values that maybe we learned in school and we never think it's possible to accomplish in real life. I think that's great.
Back, no, I know. And I think it's very important. I mean, I actually think that site planning is probably the sort of crucial thing that sets your building. And if your site plan is not very good, then your building's never going to be very good. So, I mean, even for a house, so for example, the Fall House, I don't know if you know that house that we did, they kind of cantilevers down the slope, an incredible place in Big Sur. I mean, really, the major idea for that building was the site plan, right? It was this idea that we're going to do this house that kind of cascaded down the hill. and in the long direction and sort of followed. I mean, that was it. Like once we did that, like everything else had to work within that, right? There were a lot of other design decisions about materiality and things and that, and organization and structure and light. But really, and so it's completely different to have done that than to have taken a building and made it 2 stories tall and very compacted on the site, right? Completely different idea. So I think for us, we understand that. And I think that making urban space, right, it's so important. If you make a building that makes really good urban space, then chances are it's going to be a really good building.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Not always the case. But I think if you bring the same level of creativity to making really good urban space, then I think you have a chance of also bringing the same level of creativity to making a really good urban building or a good building in general, right? So where you finish and look at it and think about it in terms of those ways. So, you have to understand that in the end, once you've built in a city, you know, what's left is the spaces that you've created, right? Because I mean, most people can't go inside your condo project, right? And they're never going to live there either. So what you have left is how you've created an environment where people who live in the building and people who don't live in the building can interact, and how the building can sort of become an incredible sort of part of the urban context. So, you know, as I said, I studied Baroque architecture because I love Baroque architecture. That was what Baroque was all about, right? It was all about this idea of the public domain and the private domain and how you put those together. And I was very influenced by those ideas.
Well, and I think that's also very...
Go check out Borromini.
And I think in the concept that you mentioned, you know, this kind of healing the city by the projects that we do, I feel like a very small touch that a building can do in a neighborhood can, you know, kind of plant a seed around it and influence other projects that will happen in that area. So it's, to me, it's something that's very important to think about.
I totally agree. And I think, you know, the thing that was great about Hayes Valley is that once the Central Freeway was torn down, basically the city, there was this neighborhood group that was left over that's called the HVNA, Hayes Valley Neighborhood Association. And those people, they were so strong in getting the freeway torn down that they also sort of basically kind of ruled the world for a long time. And they basically established with the planning department, they said, okay, we got the freeway torn down, and now we're going to make sure that whoever architects get hired to do buildings in this neighborhood are the best architects in town, or that we can find. And they made that happen, right? So you go down Hayes Valley and you can tell, like, a lot of the buildings are really pretty good, and they're a lot better than a lot of the stuff you see in other neighborhoods, including, you know, Market Street and stuff, you know, going up Market to Castro. So I think it's important to understand that the recognition of how that can all work and how you can be a part of that dialogue is really extraordinary, because I think that that's one of the reasons that Hayes Valley is so popular, right? Beyond the fact of where it is, it's also, I think, because it has that really pretty kind of high quality of buildings and urban spaces that have been made around them.
Yeah.
Which is great, which is really what you want to do in a city, right?
And I think that goes back to your point of being an activist, right? Being a female activist, but being also a designer activist, being an urban designer activist.
Yeah, I'm a total activist about everything. So. left over from those days in the 60s and 70s when I used to go out in the French, you know, I used to, you know, go and complain about I was living in France when there were a lot of riots in France about the, you know, the Vietnam War. So spent a lot of time, you know, getting tear gassed and running through sidewalks, and it's fun.
Really?
What you do when you're young.
Really? Tear gas?
Yeah, I know. You don't think about it now, but that's what we do. We go to these, you know, riots is a big word. There were more like, you know, manifestations about, you know, things going on with the Vietnam War, and we'd go and sit there, and the police would try to get us to go away, and then we'd get tear gas, and we'd go in the subway and then go home and do it again.
Wow.
Not Hong Kong, but it was our version of a small little Hong Kong. It kind of formed me, though, to think about, you know, not taking yes for an answer necessarily, but about being able to question things.
Yeah, no, I could see that for sure. Is there a project that you have not been able to do yet that you would like to design?
Oh, so many. Yeah. You know, I'd love to do like an institutional building or of some kind, some university building. We're looking at doing some housing for a while for University of California, Berkeley campus. So yes, I'd love to do one of those buildings. I think that we're kind of ready to do that. I mean, when you see some of those buildings that Grafton Architect does, if you ever go and look at the work, but I mean, there's these great sort of mid-sized institutional buildings that are so extraordinary because they're sort of publicly open, right? So they have a lot of interaction with people and the context, but they also just have these great programs. They did this incredible School of Architecture in Peru, Lima, which is when I first saw their work and stuff. So yes, I'd love to do those. I don't exactly know how I'm going to get that building yet, but still looking around. If you know anybody,
we'll send them your way.
We're ready. I think we're good. I think we could be pretty good. Actually, you need a new School of Architecture at Cal Poly. So
we'll get you some contacts.
That building is like, oh my God, that building was an idea that unfortunately didn't quite work. Right?
Well, you're not a fan of Building 5, the concrete inside out building that has a
exposed ductwork,
really cold breezeway.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yes, that's the thing, right? So this was a section.
Yeah.
That was an interesting section, but then it didn't work where it was because it's just too cold. You're too insular in there, and you never want to hang out in there, right? It feels like a leftover sort of turbine or something like that, right? They got gutted, and that's what was left. So unfortunate,
That's actually a pretty good description of a leftover turbine that's been gutted. That is what it feels like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. Well, then I guess a good question we always ask in these series is advice for people who recently graduated who are interested in doing the kind of work that you've done. Or I guess the question really is, how did you get to be as successful as you are?
I don't feel I'm that successful. That's how I got to be as successful as I am. I just always feel like there's more than we can do, right? So listen, I got lucky, right? I picked a profession pretty much out of a hat. Like I come from a family of marketing and business people, right? My grandfather was quite artistic, but otherwise my father was a great businessman, blah, blah, blah. Anyway. And I chose architecture. There's never been an architect in my family. And my daughter, who's a writer, getting an MFA in writing, isn't going to become an architect either, though clearly she's in the creative field. So there's not going to be any more architects in my part of the family. And, I got lucky that I picked something that actually in the end did make sense, right? And that I could feel like I could keep learning at and keep getting better at, and that it kept me interested. So I think finding something that keeps you interested and that has ideas that you can find that are profound enough that you want to keep working on them for the rest of your life, that's really special. And I don't think everybody gets that chance. And I feel very fortunate that I found that. So that's the main thing, right? So I think if you can find your passion, decide what that passion is, and stay true to that, that's really how you're going to have the best possible career. And that doesn't mean that you're just designing buildings, right? So for some people, that passion isn't going to be designing, beautiful single family home or designing urban, buildings. It may be anything in between, but, be true to that passion, recognize what it is, and try to kind of use it as a way to fuel your interest. Because if you don't get bored and if you're constantly challenged by something, I think, you'll get better and better at it, right? And you'll also keep yourself kind of afloat mentally, particularly when you have to do all your work in front of a computer during a pandemic. It takes a lot of kind of resilience to sort of keep doing that and to keep believing that it's okay, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm sure you guys feel the same way. So I think that's my big thing. And I think that's hard. I think a lot of people give up on things based on different ideas or they think they have to be some kind of architect, like they either have to be a high design architect or they just have to be a social architect or they have to be something else. And I actually think you don't have to do just one of those things. I think you can be all of those things, but you have to want that. That has to be what you want, right? So you have to find what you want.
I love it.
It's not easy, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, despite how difficult this particular profession is, I always say, we're still really lucky because a lot of people don't know what they want to do, and it takes a lifetime to figure it out sometimes.
Or some people don't have a passion in the job that they do every day for their entire life. We're passionate about architecture.
Right. If you have that passion and if you're willing to sort of say, okay, my passion in architecture is doing this. Like, I have friends whose passion in architecture is really running really big, very complex businesses, right? And they're really happy doing that. And I think, more power to you. Like, that is a really hard job. It's not one that I would ever want. Like, I have no interest in running a big firm like SOM or something like that. No way. I would be so bad at it. I would be fired within a couple of weeks. that's also a crucially important job, right? So and it's just as important as my job, right? It's just a different one. So I think that's what you have to be able to sort of, find and hopefully enjoy.
Well, Anne, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. The conversation was great. The presentation was awesome.
Good. Thank you. That was great. Thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of your day. Do you ever get to go out, or are you locked up inside?
We're locked up inside, but there's a backyard. So we go out in the backyard and kind of sit in the sun when it's sunny out. So we're fortunate.
Exactly. Okay. All right, cool. All right. Stay safe.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this week's episode, and thank you to our guest, Anne. We had a delightful time with her, and listeners, listen. We really appreciate that you're tuning in, and if you like what we're doing, please support our show by leaving us a review on iTunes. They're hard to come by, those reviews, but they mean a lot to us, and if you're not on iTunes, well, then just log in. Just log in into the podcast app and leave a review.
Yeah, and if you don't have an iPhone and you're not on iTunes, I do think you can, well, that's one way to do it. I do think you can download iTunes, even if you're on PC, so look it up.
Yeah, you can.
And if you have iTunes and you don't know how to leave the review, go on our website. We have a tab that tells you exactly, with little images, what the steps to leave a review.
Other than that,
because the app is not that intuitive.
Oh, okay. Well, other than that, we're on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. You can, comment and rate and give a thumbs up on YouTube. You can also find us on all the social medias, pretty much every one of them except for Vero. Was it Vero? Whatever one that was around for a bit. We're not on there anymore, really. And reach out to us via our hotline, of course, which is 213-222-6950. You can call and leave a voicemail, which we'll play on the recording, and then have a discussion about your message, or you can shoot a text to that, and we will either answer you via text or just have a conversation about it on the recording as well. Reach out with any questions, suggestions, or if you want to send us a review that way, not on iTunes, but via message or email, that can happen too. Stay tuned for the rest of this series, produced with the support of the SF Urban Program of the Architecture Department at Cal Poly. All right, everybody, this is the Midnight Shorette, and we will talk to you again next week or sooner. Bye. Are you saying?
Bye-bye.